Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Betty Chen. A new report from a UK think tank warns that Russia could launch an attack on Europe by 2027. In response to this potential threat, Germany has recently deployed a heavy combat unit to Lithuania, its first permanent overseas military presence since World War II. Meanwhile, the UK, the US, and other allies have carried out a swift response 2025 military exercise across Northern Europe and the Baltic region. Today, we take a closer look at a growing threat from Russia. What are the biggest risks Europe faces right now? And in the long term, how could China-Russia ties impact the Taiwan Strait? Joining us today are Moore Sobel, Tamkang University Diplomacy and International Relations Associate Professor, and Arthur Ding, National Zhengzhi University Professor Emeritus. A warm welcome to both of you on the show. The war in Ukraine is still ongoing, yet Russia appears to have its sight set on Europe once again. According to the UK's newspaper, The Sun, new satellite images showed that Russia is building up troops and military infrastructure near the Finnish border. Some of the new facilities are reportedly just 56 kilometers from the border. A report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies warns that if a ceasefire is reached between Russia and Ukraine this year, Moscow could launch an attack on European countries as early as 2027. So, Professor Ding, let me direct my first question to you. Could you briefly walk us through Russia's current military activity along the Nordic border, and how does it pose a threat to NATO countries?
Well, according to a report released by the CSIS, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., the Russia's attack, not the military physical attack, means that through the sabotage and the subversion, this kind of attack has increased between 2023 and 2024. For instance, the ratio is the so-called public transportation system is 27% more than previous times. And the attack on the so-called government agency, so-called website, is again increased by 27%. And attack on infrastructure increased by 21%. And attack by the so-called private business industries increased by 21%. Means that this is a real figure that Russia has done to the whole European country, not just NATO member, and probably covered all the European, Western European countries. This is one aspect. Well, the way they do it through the several approach. For instance, the explosion, and also the undercut the public infrastructure, like underwater cable, and the so-called electronic attack, and the so-called illegal immigrants. So you can see, China and Russia now employ non-military, or we call some kind of coercive approach, or gray zone approach, or hybrid approach to attack the European countries. So this is a signal that we really need to pay attention to. Yeah.
So these are the real threats. You talk about the military and non-military attacks coming from Russia against not just the Nordic countries, but also European countries as a whole. So my next question is for you, Professor Sobel. Why do some think tanks believe that Russia could invade Europe by 2027? And what is your assessment of this kind of statement?
Well, Betty, I think that it's not only think tanks and research institutions that have this kind of assessment. Many in the security establishment, the recent example, the German defense chief, warned that Russia could attack Europe in the near future. Some say 2027, some say 2029. Some even might argue that Russia could conduct a small-scale attack right now while fighting Ukraine in the Baltics. And I think that the key aspect of this assessment is once Russia ends the war in Ukraine on its own terms, it has enough to rebuild its military and thinking what comes next, attacking NATO's eastern flank. And so the thinking really shifted from if Russia is going to attack to when, where, and how. And because of it, we see really an increasing urgency of European actors and other actors to boost the defense capabilities against Russia. And the rationale is that if Ukraine holds the line as long and as best to its capabilities as possible, Russia won't be able to regroup and focus its effort on another front. And this is why also I think that many actors are quite satisfied from the recent attack by Ukraine on Russia, because that really had a major effect on Russia's capabilities currently and in the future.
Professor Sobol, you talk about it's not an issue of if, but now it's more about when and how and what they're going to do. So in terms of this timing, you said it might be 2027 or 2029. Any specific reasons, or just you talk about when the Russia-Ukraine war ends, then Europe will be the next target? What's your assessment about that?
Yes, well, the thing is that while we are all hearing about Russia facing really huge number of casualties, Russia is still rebuilding its military in quite an impressive way, and not everything that Russia is building currently is being used vis-a-vis Ukraine. So a lot of people are very, very concerned that if this military buildup will continue, and once Russia stops focusing on Ukraine, it won't have any problem to shift its resources to another maybe NATO member.
So indeed, many European countries, they have expressed their concern. For example, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz recently attended inauguration of the 45th Armored Brigade in Lithuania, marking Germany's first overseas and permanent military deployment since World War II. And according to Lithuania's Ministry of National Defense, so far Germany has deployed about 500 members of the troops there, and by 2027 they're going to scale up that total number of troops stationed there will be about 5,000. So Professor Ding, could you please tell us what's the symbolic significance of Germany having this kind of overseas deployment in Lithuania? And how do you assess the scale? Do you think that this 5,000 troops there is enough?
Well, probably let me add the one point about the why Putin's potential aggression in the future. Just several months after the launch of the invasion into the Ukraine, Putin has a long speech about his view on the so-called, simply speaking, that is so-called revitalized so-called Great Soviet Union or Great Russia, back to the old days. So Putin, for instance, Putin said, Ukraine, since ancient time, Ukraine is part of Russia. No. So since ancient time become a joke, because, but this kind of a narrative really can show, Putin's ambition in the future. Although, we don't know how and when he will launch the invasion, but this kind of a narrative really can show Putin's potential aggression in the near future. So that's why maybe this can partially explain why all kinds of speculation about 2027 or 2029. No, so this is I would say the point I want to add. Well, with regard to the Germans, the overseas deployment, this is the first time since World War II. We know that the German was defeated during the World War II, so they have so-called peace constitution. But the beginning in 1990s, the Germans start to participate in so-called international engagement, for instance, Peace Corps, peacekeeping operation, and gradually participating in the overseas operation, so on and so forth. But but German, although they become actively participate, but they're also under the invitation by United States or other countries. But this is the first time Germany play a leading role, deploy a force in Lithuania, in overseas. So this is really the turning point for whole Germany, I would say. Maybe because we know that on the one hand, President Trump wants to disengage from NATO and disengage from the European continent. So some countries need to play a leading role, and there's no doubt Germany is a big country, it's a great power in the old times. So, and Germany has very strong industrial and manufacturing capabilities. So really, Germany can play this kind of role, along with France and probably Great Britain. They jointly to defend Russia's potential aggression. So I would say this is quite a turning point for Germany, the whole state. Yeah.
What do you think about the number of troops there increasing from 500 to 5,000? Do you think that will be enough to defend Russia's invasion?
We don't know how much is enough, frankly.
Right.
But at least it can show the determination of the German and the whole so-called the Western European country. They are really realize they have to count on themselves to defend possible invasion from Russia. So I would say this symbolism probably is more important than the number, because we really don't know how much is enough. But at least Germany really start to stretch out and to show their determination, want to play a leading role, and to leading all the Western European countries to defend Russia's possible aggression behavior. Yeah.
So just like what you said, Professor Ding, Germany plays a very important role. It's a leading role in Europe, and by sending this number of troops, it shows a very important symbolic significance of its determination against Russia. Yeah. My next question will be directed to Professor Sobel. According to a report by Express, former CIA Director David Petraeus recently warned that if Russia wins in Ukraine, it may go on to invade NATO countries, and Lithuania would be the most at risk. So could you please understand why is Lithuania seen as the most likely target? And what are the key factors for this assessment?
Yeah, well, Lithuania is often mentioned as the next target for Russia. First, not only because it's very critical towards Russia and it has a rather small army, plus a small NATO battle group led by Germany, but the key here is its geographical location, right? It borders Kaliningrad, Russian territory, and Belarus, very much Russian-friendly state, and then it sits on a very, very narrow stretch of land, the Suwalki Gap, that basically, if you cut it, you isolate the Baltic region from the rest of NATO mainland, so to say. So it's a very, very vulnerable place, and that's why it's being often called NATO's Achilles heel, or even some might say that Taiwan is not the most dangerous place on Earth, but rather that area, the Suwalki Gap, is potentially the most dangerous. And once Russia actually attacks there, and because the force, even with the German troops, is rather small, reinforcement will have to come very, very, very quickly. So this is a very, very important area that everyone needs to pay attention, and that's why Germany is sending troops there. And I might add that I'm completely agree with Professor Ding that it's just another way to show the revolution even of Germany's foreign and security policy, part of the Chancellor Olaf Scholz Zeitwende, the turning point. But Chancellor Merz is doing it faster with more aggressive moves, so to say. And the fact that it's German troops has a very much of political weight. It's not just another multinational battle group or another European country, it's Germany. So German soldiers against Russian soldiers, so maybe that will act as a deterrent against Russia.
Thank you, Professor, for your sharing. We understand the importance of deterrence, and you talk about the situation of Germany and Lithuania. Now let's switch our focus to the Nordic countries. According to the Wall Street Journal, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark are now demonstrating an unprecedented level of regional security cooperation, emerging as a new pillar for European defense. And each country have their own strength. For example, Sweden contributes advanced defense technologies, including submarines and Gripen fighter jets. Norway has its own expertise in Arctic operation. Finland is very strong. They have the highest concentration of standing troops and artillery. And Denmark has special forces known for their extensive combat experience. So my question for you, Professor Sobol, we talk about the strength of these Nordic countries. Do you think that they can really work together to strengthen their security cooperation to defend against Russian invasion?
Oh, definitely. They definitely step up their game in coordinating their security and defense like never before. We are talking about joining shared exercises, sharing airspace, sharing intelligence, and even aligning the technical stuff like procurement policies, so buying the same equipment from the same companies, and syncing their ammunition. So they are really working very, very efficiently together. Now we have to add also that all four are NATO members. Yeah? So that obviously also signifies the importance of the Nordic alliance against any Russian aggression.
So how do you see this kind of military integration, Professor Dean?
Well, because they are now the NATO member, we know that the NATO, under the leadership of the United States, they have so-called very good so-called integration, so-called system integration, to bring all the different military or armies together, the so-called intelligence sharing or information sharing. So I would say as long as these four countries are NATO member and deeply work under the NATO system, then the so-called system integration can be further enhanced, and really this kind of integration can help to defend Russia's potential invasion. Look at the battle in the Ukraine. The United States or NATO provide the so-called tactical intelligence, so the Ukraine force can very flexibly and efficiently to attack whatever the target and really destroy and destroy Russia force morale, so on and so forth. So that's why I would say, this kind of a work together, further integration is extremely important for these four small countries to work together to defend themselves.
Professor Ding, you talk about the role of the United States, and just recently the U.S., along with some other European countries, have launched the Swift Response military exercise. So how do you see Washington's strategic thinking behind this kind of alliance?
Yeah, these days, people focus on President Trump because President Trump wanted to disengage from European continent and play a less and less role in the so-called European country. But we have to focus, the Arctic area is become more and more important. So-called Arctic region become more and more important because, the more intense competition between United States, Russia, and China. So although those small countries, my point is that we should not just focus on these four small countries because those four small countries in very close to the Arctic regions. So U.S. role with these four countries also, we have to broaden our view to so-called the Arctic region and how United States works with these four small countries and other Arctic countries in Arctic regions. They work together to compete with Russia and China.
Professor Sobol, President Trump has mentioned that the U.S. might withdraw from NATO. And what about the current U.S. status, and what's your assessment on that?
Well, the U.S. is still in NATO, and U.S. troops are still participating actively in joint exercises. So operationally speaking, the U.S. is very much committed to NATO and the defense of Europe. Politically speaking, well, that's a different story, and we are all aware of what Trump said or think about NATO. President Trump was very, very critical about the alliance. It sees it as something like what Trump usually does, kind of a transactional deal. You pay for protection. And in this context, President Trump was very critical, saying and pushing European countries and other NATO members to, well, spend more. And to be honest, some of the criticism is, well, defensible. Yeah? European countries did not spend enough and did not work hard enough to protect themselves and counted on the American security umbrella. President Trump also is against, at least he always was, against NATO expansion, especially in the context of Ukraine. So operationally speaking, the US is still very much committed to NATO. NATO is still an American-led military alliance. Politically, we do have problems, but I do think that even if we forget the democratic values, or Trump does not pay much attention to democratic values, until the US actually does something beyond the political statements, I think that the US is still very much committed to the defense of the alliance and to the defense of Europe.
Now let's switch our focus to another important player, that is China. So we see that the Ukraine's intelligence chief has said that China actually has provided a lot of critical weapons or supplies to Russia for the war. And just recently, European leaders are going to visit Beijing. They're going to attend the important China-EU summit. And this year also marks the 50th anniversary of EU and also China diplomatic ties. So, and according to the media report, Xi Jinping might attend this important summit. Professor Ding, what should we be watching for at this high-level summit?
Yeah, President Trump's policy really created a problem for the European country and the EU. There's no doubt about it. So each country have to hedge for themselves, for their own so-called national interests. There's no exception for the EU as a whole. There's no doubt about it. But there's a problem between EU and China. The biggest problem is China's support to the Russia, and what we see is this kind of China support and the very close tie with Russia will stay for quite a long time, and we don't see China will reduce their support. So if China's support continue to be strong to Russia, and the relationship between EU and China will be always problematic there, because European countries want to have peace in Ukraine, and China continued support for Russia will embolden Russia, frankly speaking. Russia continue to bombard and refuse to present so-called peace negotiation or truce without condition. So this is the biggest problem. My point is that as long as China continue to provide support to Russia, and then there will be a biggest barrier for EU and China to improve their mutual relation. Although there's no doubt, EU really have high expectation about China market, but this is another story because Xi Jinping really don't want to open his domestic market, frankly speaking, and Xi Jinping will never open his domestic market. What Xi Jinping favors export-oriented, so-called overcapacity, and Xi Jinping will not back down from this kind of overcapacity. So, yeah, no doubt EU will continue to visit China, and Xi Jinping might hold. But frankly speaking, at least from what I can see, it's likely for them to improve relations were very low. Yeah.
Talking about a cooperation between China and Russia, it's not just a one-way street. Actually, according to a report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, it seems that if China is going to invade Taiwan, Russia they may not directly involved, but they might use the gray zone operations to support Beijing. So what kind of strategic support could Moscow offer to China if China is going to invade Taiwan? Professor Sobol.
So, obviously, there is a very little chance that we are going to see Russian troops fighting for China in Taiwan or across the Straits. As you've mentioned, Russia is specialized in gray zone operations. So most probably, Russia will play a disturbed role in this conflict. Now, that also means that for Taiwan, and to some extent for the US as well, we cannot focus, if there is a conflict, we cannot focus or we cannot think or assume that this is going to be just on one front. And here, Russia is going to play a major role, which also means that for Taiwan and for the US, it's very important to share intelligence, to deal with cybersecurity, and for Taiwan to keep the US, Europe, and hopefully other like-minded countries engaged in order not to be completely isolated because other allies will be busy dealing with the Russians.
So, Professor Sobel talked about the intelligence cooperation and the cybersecurity, and also Taiwan has to deepen its cooperation with the U.S., EU, and other like-minded partners. What should Taiwan do to strengthen our defense against any possible threats?
Well, many things we should do, frankly speaking, because there will be a long game, I would say, between Taiwan and China, and between probably Taiwan and Russia. We hope not. As I say, it will be a long game. So I would say, we have the so-called whole of nation, whole of state effort to strengthen ourselves from across the board. I would say, for instance, cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and the military and the defense, so-called resilience, that issue that our government really pay more and more attention on that. So I would say it's a long game, so we have to have whole nation effort to build up ourselves. Yeah.
Definitely, we don't want to see any kind of war happening across the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah.
We have to be fully prepared, and we can draw upon the experiences that happens in other parts of the world. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you for joining our show today. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe, and see you next time.